one of the great names of Arabian studies. He pioneered the field of Ancient North Arabian and made invaluable contributions to the history of Arabia and the nomads of the Near East, as well as their languages and scripts. He is also a research associate of the Khalili Research Center, honorary fellow of Wolfson College, University of Oxford, fellow of the British Academy, and is a trustee of the International Association for the Study of Arabia. It is truly a pleasure to have with me today on Real Talk with Tehran Poole, the great epigraphist and linguist, Mr. Michael C.A. Macdonald. How are you doing today, sir? And thank you for joining me for what I believe is going to be a really exciting discussion.
Well, thank you very much. You're far too kind in your introduction, but I'm fine and looking forward to talking to you. Yes, thank you.
All right. And yes, over the last couple of years, I've been indulging myself in your works. Just your research on the history of the Arabs before the coming of Islam is truly fascinating. And I believe it's starting to gain a wide variety of popularity at the moment. And I hope it continues to go in that direction because this is really fascinating work. But a considerable amount of people have not the slightest idea, as I did not several years ago, to what the field of epigraphy is all about. So for those watching who may still be clueless concerning your profession, Michael, can you please tell us what it is you do as an epigraphist?
Yes, indeed. Sort of technically, epigraphy is the study of ancient inscriptions. So writing on stone, but it can be extended now. So, for instance, modern epigraphists can study spray painted graffiti on walls, but it's basically reading what people have written on permanent surfaces rather than in manuscripts and books. So inscriptions you could define perhaps as statements, public statements. And so you have a public inscription, a formal inscription by the local authorities saying, keep out, danger, things like that. Or you can have graffiti, which is a personal statement by an individual, but put in a public place. So it's different. For instance, if you write, I hate Putin, perhaps I shouldn't say that.
Well, it's relevant for today. It's relevant in today's geopolitics.
Yes, but you could write it in your diary, and that would be a private expression of your feelings. But if you write it on a wall, then that's a public expression of your feelings. So that's basically what epigraphy is about.
Okay. And what sparked your interest in studying inscriptions, or what got you into epigraphy?
Well, I've always been interested in languages, which is rather perverse because I am actually very good at forgetting them and not so good at learning them. But I have studied, always been very interested in history. And as my life went on through childhood and adolescence, I became interested in earlier and earlier periods of history. And then by pure chance, I met on a dig in 1970 in Jordan, a man who was the world expert on the sort of inscriptions that I work on now. And so he filled me with enthusiasm, and I went back to Oxford and studied Arabic and Aramaic and Syriac, and then went out as a volunteer to work with him on these inscriptions. So the rest is history, as they say. I mean, I just continued. I don't think he wanted a volunteer, by the way, but he was very kind to me and let me come and work with him.
Was that a part of your, maybe an elective while you were in uni, or was that a part of the degree you were working towards, going on excavations
No, it was, I did one degree, which was English language and literature, in which I studied the philology, the language, the development of the English language. Then in the holidays after that, I'd finished that degree, I went on this excavation in Jordan. And it was in those days, they would allow you to go and they would teach you what to do. You didn't have to be qualified. The workmen actually taught you how to dig properly, which was because they were very experienced. They were the level.
So if I got this straight, you started basically from nothing. Zero understanding of what epigraphy was about, and the person who taught you filled you with all of this knowledge, and that's where you got inspired to continue in that direction.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yes. I mean, I knew literally what epigraphy meant, of course, and had looked at Anglo-Saxon inscriptions and so on when I was studying English and so on. But generally, I had no idea about these ancient nomads who were writing graffiti on the rocks of the desert and things like that, or the ancient history of Arabia, although I was fascinated by the Middle East and particularly by the Arab countries.
And that was my next question. Why the Near East, namely Syria, Jordan, and Arabia as your area of research?
Well, this is rather embarrassing. Between school and university, in what's now known as the gap year, I decided to go to the Middle East for the very bad reason that it was the only part of the world that my much traveled family hadn't been to. So, I was an adolescent. So I did a crash course in Arabic for 2 months before I went. And I spent 5 months wandering around with a rucksack and £50, which was all one was allowed to take out of the country at that time in England. And people were so kind to me and so hospitable, and it was just such a fascinating area that I came back, and although I was supposed to be studying English language and literature at the university, I spent a lot of my time reading up about Islam and Arabs and pre-Islamic history and so on, much more than I should have done, really, because I should have been studying for the English. But anyway, so I had that background, and that's really what drew me back to the Middle East. And I have to say that the kindness of people there was quite extraordinary. Even when they were suffering, they would still make a cup of tea for a stranger.
Amazing.
Awesome.
And as someone who's been in the field for over 40 years, have you noticed an increase in interest shown to your area of research compared to when you first started? Like I can imagine telling someone in a table side conversation, I'm an epigraphist, that there is a level of mystery to that. Like, again, like I mentioned several years ago, if you had said you were an epigraphist, I would have never known what that was. But it seems like today, the popularity of epigraphy concerning the Middle East has grown so much that it's almost, at least in the circles I communicate with people in, it's almost just like common knowledge to know what epigraphy is. Hopefully I didn't say too much and lost the question in the process.
No, absolutely. No, I still find in England, even, talking to educated people, you say epigraphist and they pick on the one syllable that they recognize, which is pig, and they think you're a farmer. So I have to explain that I'm not a farmer, but but people, yes, understand a bit more about inscriptions now. In the actual countries in the Middle East, people understand much more than here in the West, because it's their heritage after all. And so, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, there are large numbers of young and sort of people of all ages who go out at weekends and try to find inscriptions and photograph them and then put them on Facebook or Twitter and so on. And a lot of these inscriptions are previously unknown. So it's a very important way of discovering where these inscriptions are. So yes, I find that people are actually interested in the particular sort of inscriptions that I work a lot on, which are these graffiti by ancient nomads, because they are, as far as I know, unique in that a particular kind of graffiti written by ancient nomads, which is in the deserts from southern Syria through northeastern Jordan into Saudi Arabia, northern Saudi Arabia. They actually say quite a lot, and they're very revealing about the feelings of the people who wrote them. And so they didn't just write their name and say Kilroy was here. They actually wrote their names and their genealogy often, but then said they're cold and hungry, or they're lost, or a wild animal has come and taken a sheep or their dog. And because we have tens of thousands of them, of these graffiti, we get a picture of the individuals and their society, which we don't have for any other group in the ancient Middle East, because in the settled areas, people would write on soft materials like papyrus and so on, which have all disappeared outside, anywhere outside Egypt. If they wrote graffiti on the walls, most of the walls have come down, of course, they're ruined. So it's extraordinary. I mean, that we have this, it's like tens of thousands of pages from diaries, different diaries, scattered all over the desert.
I actually like what you said, tweets from the desert.
Yes,
I believe that definitely encapsulates what they are, given the context and what they convey. You also mentioned something that I found very interesting, and it kind of flies in the face of Muslim tradition concerning pre-Islamic Arabia, is that in the Arabian Peninsula, in the ancient world, writing was more prevalent there than anywhere in the Near East.
Yes, absolutely. And we don't know particularly why, but Arabia had its own form of the alphabet. So when the alphabet was invented in the second millennium BC, it split very quickly.
We're going to get to that just so we don't jump ahead a bit. Okay. That's actually a part that I'm very much interested in. And I've spent quite a bit of time looking at some of your charts you've had from other lectures that you gave. But I'm actually still a little bit interested in how the field of epigraphy concerning the Arabian Peninsula and its environs developed. I mean, thanks to epigraphy, as well as archaeology and philology, outstanding contributions have been made to our understanding of Arabia in antiquity. One contribution, and the one I find to be the most fascinating, is how they have discovered a diversity of scripts and languages which existed in Arabia from its most ancient recorded history until right before the advent of Islam in the 7th century. So just to take it back a bit, when did Euro-American academics begin to discover these inscriptions that were obviously in strange scripts, and how did they perceive thereafter before being deciphered? I can imagine that between the discovery of these inscriptions and deciphering them, there was a level of mystery, like what are these things? And I can only imagine the theories that came out of that until we actually knew what they were saying.
Yes, well, the South Arabian inscriptions from what is now Yemen and the Far in southern Oman were first discovered in, I think, well, in the 1840s by an English captain of an English ship who went ashore and copied an inscription that he saw there. And he didn't know what it was, but he thought it was interesting. And so he published it in his book that he wrote about his voyages around the Arabian Peninsula. And this caused a lot of interest. And it took only about 15 years before the script was deciphered, because fortunately, one relative of this script still survives, which is the vocalized alphabet used in Ethiopia for the Ge'ez and the Amharic and other languages there. And so the South Arabian script was sufficiently similar to the Ge'ez one, to the Ethiopian one, that they could quite quickly work out. But they then had to work out what the language was, which was quite different from Arabic and quite different from Ethiopian. And so that took much longer. In the north, the earliest inscriptions were discovered in 1858 by a Scotsman called Cyril Graham in southern Syria. And he discovered them near a great outcrop of lava called the Safa. And so they were called the Safa'itic inscriptions after that. Ironically, no Safa'itic inscriptions have been found in the Safa. It was only on the edge of it. But anyway, and gradually then more explorers, French and German explorers, went into Arabia towards the end of the 19th century. An English explorer called Doughty, Charles Doughty, who wrote a very famous book called Arabia Deserta of his travels there, also copied inscriptions there. And so gradually these inscriptions became known, but they weren't deciphered until the beginning of the 20th century. And actually there are still some versions of the scripts which haven't been properly deciphered and are really, so work is being done on them now. So what was divided in the north of Arabia, they were divided into the inscriptions which were only graffiti written by nomads, and the inscriptions in the oases of Tema and Dadan, which is modern Alula in northwest Arabia. And then a whole lot which were put into a pending file called, which they called Thamudic, which has nothing to do with the ancient tribe of Thamud.
And I was a little disappointed about that, but we will get to another topic later where Thamud definitely makes a presence, or the presence felt.
So, but within this Thamudic class, there are possibly more than a dozen different scripts. And the more people are recording them photographically, the more we realize how many differences there are, because originally most of the Thamudic inscriptions were only known from hand copies by people who couldn't read the inscriptions, of course, and so they didn't know sometimes how to distinguish between a crack in the rock or a line that had been carved. So basically we have two groups of urban inscriptions, Tema and Dadan, and the rest are all nomads who for some reason learned to read and write. We've no idea really why they learned to read and write, because it's not at all useful for nomads in their life, because all they have to write on are rocks. So you obviously you can't send a letter written on a rock, or record that you've sold your camel to somebody on a rock. And so they remained non-literate oral societies. So they stored everything in their memories rather than writing it down, and they communicated by word of mouth rather than sending letters. But the one thing they really needed was something to stave off boredom when they were looking after the camels and the sheep and the goats pasturing, because they would spend all day out with the animals with nothing to do. And so they picked up the scripts. And of course, when you're in an oral society, you develop a very good memory, because you've got to remember everything. So they learn very quickly. So they started carving their names, and then there was still quite a lot of time that day. So they carved, what they were thinking or what they'd rather be doing, or rude remarks about each other. I mean, very schoolboy.
It seems like more of a pastime that they learned how to write and utilize writing.
Absolutely. It was a pastime. And occasionally they would use it for something serious, like writing a memorial for somebody who died. So when somebody who was much loved died, they would build a huge cairn over him, a pile of stones over him or her, and they would, each person would bring a stone, carve their name and the fact that they were mourning for this person, or they were helping build the cairn, and then put it on the cairn. So you get these great piles of stones, sometimes with hundreds of these inscriptions on them, all mourning the particular person who's in the cairn or under it.
And you mentioned some inscriptions, and I would like to get to them. From what I gathered by reading your CV or your background, researching your background, is that in the field of epigraphy, as it pertains to Syria, Jordan, and Arabia, your main area of interest seems to focus on ancient North Arabian scripts and languages. One thing I noticed about ancient North Arabian is that it has more categories of scripts than its sister script, South Arabian. Can you elucidate the categories of ancient North Arabian scripts? In my opinion, they're not as straightforward as what you find with ancient South Arabian, where you have the Musnad and Zabur. As you mentioned, with North Arabian scripts, you have Tayman, you have the Oasis scripts. You also have the scripts from the Nomad, and I think there might be some other that I'm missing in there.
It's basically a division between Oasis and nomads. I should just say about ancient South Arabian that although there were 4 different kingdoms and 4 different languages in ancient South Arabia, they all used the same script. So you had the monumental script, as you say, the Musnad, and the script called Zabur, used for carving with a sharp knife on the stems of palm leaves or on sticks. They don't seem to have used papyrus and ink. And so, but gradually the Zabur, the Musnad letters become more and more cursive in their forms in the Zabur. So it's not a separate script, it's just a development from the Musnad.
Okay.
In the north, you have what is very interesting in Tema. Tema was one of the most important oases in pre-Islamic Arabia because it was its position. It was an extremely rich oasis from the point of view of water. It's where several different watercourses all join there. So the water, even now when vast amounts of water are taken out every day, the water level is still quite high there. So that was good, but also it was in a position where if you were coming from the south up to the north, and that's how the trade routes came, because in the south they produced frankincense and myrrh, and they also imported in the south from India and the Southeast Asia a lot of aromatics of perfumes and spices and things. So they would bring them up the west side of the peninsula, and then at Tema they could split. Either they could go northeast to Mesopotamia, to what is now Iraq, or they could go northwest towards the Mediterranean, because of course the Greeks and Romans were very keen on these products, and Egypt. So it was the best position where you could choose which way to go. There Tema was particularly interesting because it had its own script. Its language has now recently been discovered, is not related to Arabic, but is related much more to Hebrew and Aramaic. So
Wow.
up in the north. But from the middle of the 6th century BC, so about 550 BC, the last king of Babylon conquered all the North Arabian oases, and he set up his home in Tema. And it's amazing when you think of all the magnificence of Babylon. He came to this oasis, and he stayed there for 10 years of his 17
And we still don't know why he decided to move from Babylon to Tema.
There are lots of theories, but nothing that you can prove, unfortunately. Anyway, he came there, and he brought with him Aramaic as the language of his administration, because by that time they were using cuneiform and Akkadian, the traditional writing, only for official royal inscriptions and religious inscriptions. For day-to-day activities, they would use Aramaic, and so Aramaic came into Tema, and gradually it pushed out the original Temanitic script, and things more and more got written in Aramaic.
Did you do the same thing with Didanic?
No. That's very interesting. What happened in Dedan, we get very few Aramaic inscriptions until the Nabateans come, and we can talk about the Nabateans later. So Dedan kept its own script and its own language, and which is also not Arabic. It seems to be related to Arabic, but it's actually different from it. So it's a cousin of Arabic, should we say. And there, it seems to be almost certain that they actually did write with pen and ink as well. We haven't found any examples, unfortunately. But what you can see is the development of the letter forms in the inscriptions are becoming cursive, more and more sort of as if they were written in ink. And the people who were carving them, either the stonemasons or ordinary people who were just scratching on the rock, they seem to have not minded using a monumental form of a letter right next to its cursive form as well. So you get this very strange mixture of letter forms, the same letter, language, different forms, yes, in the same inscription. And that, to me, shows that they must have been writing in ink, because you on stone, there is no reason to change the letter forms. Whereas if you're writing in ink, you want to be quicker or easier and so on. And so the letter forms develop. And in Dedan, we have a lot of official inscriptions, a lot of religious inscriptions, but also a lot of graffiti, which suggests that the ordinary people in the oasis could also read and write, and they just went around. But their graffiti is much more. They're much shorter than the nomads. Obviously, I suppose they didn't have as much time to kill.
And I wonder how long. And maybe you might not be able to tell me this, but how long do you think it took to inscribe? Carve into these rocks? I can, and what kind of tools did they use? I can imagine why you couldn't do cursive in a rock, because it's hard to drag across a rock. But I wonder, did they use chisel and stone?
It's interesting. You can see. I mean, you can do cursive on a rock.
Okay,
if that's how it is. So, for instance, the Nabatean script, which the Nabateans were an Arab tribe that settled in southern Jordan, and Petra, many people may have heard of Petra, but it became their capital. But they spoke Arabic, but they wrote in Aramaic, because at that time Arabic wasn't a written language. and so but their form of the Aramaic script developed in writing on with ink, and so a lot of the letters are joined up, and that then is put into the inscriptions. The letters are still joined up in the inscriptions. But to go back for a moment to yes, what they used in the Basalt Desert, in the area I mentioned where the Safavidic inscriptions are, which is southern Syria, northeastern Jordan, northern Saudi Arabia. This is a desert which is basically limestone, but on top of it there have been huge lava flows from volcanoes along the so in southern Syria and northeastern Jordan, you have a line of volcanoes, and millions of years ago, they poured vast quantities of lava, about 100 kilometers away. And gradually, these sheets of lava broke up into billions of stones and boulders and so on, which are lying on top of the limestone bases. Now, limestone is where you find a lot of flint. And so what they seem to have done is to have used the flint as to carve on this basalt. And they carved in different ways. Sometimes they would incise like that, you get a very thin line. Sometimes they would just go boom, boom, with boom like that, which is very messy when you're trying to write letters. And sometimes they would take one stone and another and hit it like that as a chisel. And so you can tell these different techniques. And so the chiseling often was very, very beautifully done. But you can see the bumps in the line when you look very closely for each blow. Further south in Dadan and Tema, it's sandstone. So that's relatively easy to carve. And again, they probably would have carved with flints or with some sort of sharp object, but possibly not with knives, because you don't want to blunt your knife and then have to sharpen it again. You know, you need your knife to protect yourself and so on. But basically, they carved, but it's much easier, as I say, to carve on sandstone. So anyway.
Oh, no, I do have a question about ancient North Arabian. I'm not sure, okay, so we have the different scripts, Didanic, Dumaic, Taymanetic, and the inscriptions of the nomads. Are these different dialects of the same language? Are they distinct languages from each other?
They're distinct languages, but North Arabian, ancient North Arabian, actually refers to the script rather than the languages. Okay. So all these scripts are related to each other, and they're related to ancient South Arabian, but the languages are different. So Taymanitic, as I said, was closer to Aramaic than to Arabic. Dadanitic was like a cousin of Arabic, not Arabic, but not so far away. And the Safavidic and the Hismaic nomadic scripts use a recorder language which does seem to be Arabic. It's the earliest Arabic we had. And ironically, while people like the Nabateans thought you couldn't write Arabic, you had to use Aramaic or something like that, these nomads were writing just as they spoke. So they were writing Arabic. So the earliest written Arabic is by these nomads of southern Syria, Jordan, and northern Saudi Arabia. But the people like the Nabateans who were settled and thought rather highly of themselves, obviously weren't going to take over a script by mere nomads, you know, and so they went on writing Aramaic, which had a lot of prestige about it, and Aramaic as well. So,
and I also would like to mention that you have a website where all these North Arabian inscriptions are cataloged for people who are interested in doing some research on their own. It is called OCIANA, Online Corpus of Inscriptions of Ancient North Arabia. I will put a link in the description. But I would like to know, what is the background behind you developing that website, and what was your intent for creating it? I mean, I know to catalog your finds, but you know, just in case there was anything else behind it.
No, well, I started off in 1994, in fact, because I decided that there were so many of these ancient North Arabian inscriptions. I mean, there were about 20,000 in those days, which is very small compared to what it is now, but that it would be sensible to make a database for them. And a colleague of mine called Dr. Leila Neme, who had just finished her doctorate then, came, and she's now the world expert on Nabatean, by the way, but she came and she set up a database for me. They actually created the database, and then I put in all the inscriptions, Sapiitic inscriptions. Then in 2013, the Khalili Research Center, where I was a research associate of, I suggested to them that we should ask for a grant to expand it for all the ancient North Arabian inscriptions. And so we were given a grant by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in Britain. And we were able to employ people who are experts in these inscriptions. There aren't very many, so we almost employed the whole lot. And they, for 3.5 years, entered all these inscriptions in. So we now have something like 45,000, something like that. I can't remember exactly.
Double since 1994.
Oh, yes, more, in fact, yes. So that is very good. And we had the whole structure had to be completely changed, of course, because the different inscriptions, types of inscriptions need different things, and you have to have a structure where you can search through all these different types of inscriptions, and that was done by Daniel Burt at the Khalili Research Center, who's the great IT expert there. And this goes on now. The project finished in 2017, but we still are entering inscriptions as they come, new inscriptions, and also trying to change, sometimes correct things, because further study of particular inscriptions has shown that they actually should be read in a different way. And so we are trying to put in the latest research into this.
And that's one thing I've noticed on the website, is that you have a history of how certain inscriptions have been translated, yes, from when it was first deciphered to a more modern translation, based on the new research, I'm guessing, that you've discovered.
Yes, that's right. Yes. And so then last year, no, 2 years ago, I set up a charity called the Foundation for the Study of Ancient Arabian Languages and Cultures, which I hope we will get sufficient funds to continue employing people to go on entering inscriptions into Oceana. And also, I'm so sorry, I got a cold. Also to start bringing things out, so you could have a concordance of all the genealogies, because some of these genealogies go up to 20 generations. The nomad would write, so he was so-and-so, son of so-and-so, son of so-and-so. Wow. Go. That's if he couldn't think of anything else to write. But it does mean that we have the social structure then through the genealogies, and to make dictionaries and grammars and so on. But also to draw out the historical content of these inscriptions. And for that, we need really to have quite a lot of money to employ people who are going to be able to work on it full time. At the moment, it's just a few people like me and Ahmed El-Jalad and others who are trying to keep up, but
yeah.
The number of inscriptions being found is so great that we're always behind.
Yeah, in a way, it seems like that's a good sign, but yeah, the keeping up part is I believe is a necessary thing. I see a lot of, like as you mentioned, people from the Gulf posting on Twitter, Facebook, inscriptions that they find, and I can only imagine how to keep up with that level of production from people posting pictures. And I do actually want to get into Arabs and Arabias before late antiquity. That's just like kind of a spin-off from your the article you wrote called Arabs, Arabias, and Arabic before late antiquity, but we'll get to the Arabic part later. I actually found out about that article of yours from your friend Ahmed Al-Jalad. It was the first paper of yours that I ever read. And the two topics you focus on in that paper have been of great interest to a wide variety of people lately, and they are Arab identity and the Arabic language before the advent of Islam. I already interviewed Peter Webb concerning his book, Imagining the Arabs, Arab Identity, and the Rise of Islam. And it's probably his work on the subject I'm more familiar with. So please excuse me with my next line of questioning. I'm just going to press you a little bit with some of the arguments found in his book that I just mentioned. Okay, well, first, are you familiar with his work?
Yes.
And do you have any thoughts on it? You know, just any type of scholarly critique. I mean, how did you receive it?
I found I should perhaps have begun at the end rather than at the beginning, because I find myself much more sympathetic to the arguments he gives in the second half of the book than in the first half, where I think in his effort to show that there was no Arab identity before Islam, or just until just before Islam, he actually made some mistakes in his treatment of the Akkadian evidence, for instance, and there was, to me, it was all special pleading, and as well as actual mistakes and so on. So I wasn't very sympathetic with that, but you know, I can see his point, and I agree with something I myself said in some articles, this idea of bringing people together of an Arab nation, all distinguished by their presence in the great genealogy that was concocted after the rise of Islam, and so I think so. You know, I'm in two minds, shall we say, depending on whether we're talking about the first half or the second half.
And yeah, I mean, I guess from untrained eyes, the first half of his book seemed very convincing to me. It seemed like he was trying to resuscitate a debate between Noldika and D.H. Mueller, where Mueller was under the impression that before the rise of Islam, Arab identity didn't exist. But let's start actually with Gindibu, because that's kind of where he started, and also who some people believe to be the first Arab in recorded history, mentioned in the Krukuk, probably butchered that name, monolith of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III. Dr. Webb, of course, is in disagreement that Gindibu and his Arba'a were the first Arabs. And rather than proof of Arab ethnic identity, Webb puts forth the idea that Assyrian scribes may have coined the name simply as Akkadian language administrative jargon, connoting Westerners, outsiders, or steppe nomads, and not to specify an actual ethnicity. And so what are your thoughts on Gindibu, his Arba'a, and them being the first Arabs in recorded history?
Well, first I should just say that, well, two things. One is that I don't think Peter Webb has any evidence for this. He's just speculating. But you also said Gindibu was the first Arab. Of course, he's only the first Arab to be mentioned in a written source. It doesn't mean that he was the Adam
before him.
The Arab nation.
I'm sorry, I meant to. I probably should have added that caveat in recorded history.
Yeah. So I mean, he was the first time. It's the first time that we have. So far, let's hope we'll find something earlier. But yes, I cannot see in all the Assyriologists that I know agree that Aba means Arab. I mean, there are lots of different ways in which it's spelt, but in virtually all of them, it has a determinative, a little extra sign which says that it is a people or a country that they're talking about. And that's something that Peter Webb didn't understand, didn't realize. And so it cannot mean nomad if it's got this determinative. It means, Arab or Arabia in other contexts and so on. But it's so that's one thing. Also, it seems that the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they mention these Arabs, that they found Arabs, and they mention them a lot. I mean, we have a lot of cases, and they and very often we get Greek and Roman historians 400, 500, 600 years later finding Arabs in exactly the same spots.
Yeah.
In Lebanon, in northern Syria, in central Syria, in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq.
Parts of the Sinai.
Parts of the Sinai, absolutely. And so these are, it's what the conclusion that we come to, I think we are forced to, is that Arabs are first recorded, and it's very important to say first recorded, in the north, in Syria and Lebanon and Sinai, Palestine, not in Arabia, in the peninsula, that and that actually the peninsula came to be called Arabian by mistakes made by Greeks, who thought that because the merchants who sold them the frankincense were Arabs, because they dominated the northern part of the trade route, that the Arabs must have grown the incense as well in the south, whereas the people in South Arabia would not have recognized themselves as being called Arabs, and would in fact.
That part is, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but that part I found to be mind-blowing, because as I mentioned to you before, my first introduction to pre-Islamic Arabia was reading traditional Muslim era sources. And in that, they project that Arabs and the Arabic language stemmed from Southern Arabia. And then when I started reading works, your work, Ahmed Al-Jalad and other epigraphists working in that area, to see that Arabic or signs of Arabic, as well as the mentioning of Arabs, seem to be concentrated in the northern part of the peninsula, totally just turned my understanding upside down. And that's actually what kind of kept leading me in the direction of researching Arab identity and what was going on in pre-Islamic Arabia. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to add that part in there.
Fine. No, I think it is one of the problems that because of the contemporary events that were happening under the Umayyads, the early Umayyads particularly, where the people from Yemen who had become Muslims very early and had been some of the leaders of the Arab conquests out of the peninsula, because they were rather important politically, they could also, and being Arab was very important at that stage to distinguish you from your Muslim subjects who had been conquered, and who theoretically were all Muslim brothers, but were actually, the conquerors wanted to remain different.
Elite status.
So then they created this genealogy, including all the biblical patriarchs and prophets, as well as the Arabian prophets, and but they produced this myth that the Arabs came from Yemen, whereas if you'd asked anybody before Islam in Yemen, they said, no, we're not Arabs. They're up there so further north. And so that, I think, was, and of course, once you write down genealogy, then it's fixed. And so anybody who wanted to prove they were an Arab, say, well, look, this is my genealogy goes back to this, and that would be all right.
All right. And, I remember watching a lecture of yours on YouTube where you mentioned that based on the epigraphic record, we have no evidence of what the inhabitants called the whole of the Arabian Peninsula pre-Islam. And if I understood Peter's work correctly, he is of the opinion that successive empires following the Assyrians up to the Achaemenids basically adopted Akkadian language administrative jargon and how they use Arab cognate words to describe outsiders, while not having, sorry, I probably wrote too much for this question, but the main thing that and you actually answered this, how we came to understand the Arabian Peninsula as Arabia was the product of Greeks. Before Alexander's naval expedition across the Red Sea, Herodotus had described Arabia as whatever is between Egypt and Mesopotamia. But thanks to Alexander, and I believe few historians followed him thereafter in that assumption, but it was thanks to the naval expedition of Alexander that he demarcated what Arabia would eventually become. So I guess you would agree with that assessment. At first I was going to see if you had any pushback behind that, but you already kind of described that previously before I asked this question. So I don't think you would be in disagreement with that assessment right there.
No, more or less. It's Alexander's attempts to go around the peninsula, to circumnavigate the peninsula from the Gulf to the Red Sea and vice versa, showed him that it was all one land, which hadn't been really understood before, because nobody had traveled across it. I mean, no Greeks had traveled across it. And in fact, a very important stage in this process of describing it as Arabia, the peninsula as Arabia, is recorded by, gosh, it's gone straight out of my head, I'm sorry, who actually wrote about it. But one of the pilots, one of the guides on one of Alexander's ships, as they were coming out of the Persian Gulf and round the coast of Oman, said, that land is part of Arabia. Now, how he knew, I mean, what he meant by that, of course, but probably he meant it was part of the land which produced the frankincense, which they called Arabia Eudaimon in Greek and Arabia Felix in Latin. But we just have that one little bit of information. We don't have any explanation of how it came along. And but so Alexander confirmed that it was a peninsula, but nobody whose writings have survived had actually been done right from the north to the south, or come from the south to the north. There probably were Greek traders who had done that, but gone with the caravan up the west. But they didn't write about it, unfortunately, so we don't know. So yes, it is basically that. So one writer, Greek writer, for instance, thought that Arabia Felix started in the north, and the whole peninsula was this wonderful, lush place. Eventually, it's only when we get very late to Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD that they realize that there is Arabia Deserta, the desert, north in the north, and then only in the south is this lush place which produces the frankincense.
Speaking of Ptolemy, was it Ptolemy who divided the peninsula into 3 separate parts? Was it Petra, Deserta, and Felix? He's responsible for that.
Yes, he didn't divide the peninsula into 3. He divided Arabia.
I keep forgetting that the peninsula and Arabia are can be 2 different things.
Yes, absolutely. And so you had Arabia all over the Near East, lots of Arabias. So Arabia Petraea was what was basically the Nabatean, had been the Nabatean kingdom. The whole of Jordan and a little bit of Syria, modern Syria. But yes, it's always important to remember that Arabia means lots of different places.
The peninsula is that
just one
exactly.
one of them, yes.
All right, and continue on with Ptolemy. Something I did not find mentioned in Webb's work, but they are definitely talked about in your paper, Arabs, Arabias, and Arabic before late antiquity, are the 29 inscriptions where Arab is mentioned as some kind of identity marker, 16 of which you believe are safe to say are self-identifications, with the remaining 13 about which there are uncertainties. And another interesting fact about these 29 inscriptions is that 26 out of 29 of them are written in Greek. How do we explain such a high concentration of people identifying as Arabs and also writing in Greek in or around the Ptolemaic Egypt?
Well, so I'm just working out which way to where to start. So they were writing in Greek because that was the normal language, particularly for non-Egyptians in Ptolemaic Egypt. I mean, the Ptolemies were Greeks, were Macedonians, but Greeks. And so if you wanted to write, then that's what you used, and it was the administrative language and so on. Okay. Some more old-fashioned Egyptians would still write in Demotic, the cursive form of the hieroglyphic Egyptian. But so that's one thing. They would identify as Arabs because I think Arabs were, there were lots of different ethnic identities within Ptolemaic Egypt, and you got taxed according to your ethnic identity very often. Arabs had also been in Eastern Egypt, so on the edge of the Red Sea, since at least the 6th century BC, because that's when Herodotus says that they were there. We have Arabs as tax collectors, actually, quite a lot of references to Arabs as tax collectors. And in fact, it became an Arabarch in Greek, which should mean a leader of the Arabs, came to be used as slang for a tax collector. So they were obviously very good at doing that. So basically, there seem to have been quite a few Arabs. It's not surprising that there were Arabs in Egypt. The fact that we have all the evidence comes from Egypt is just that the papyri survive in Egypt.
And you mentioned that earlier in the talk, that all the papyri outside of Egypt are basically have been destroyed for whatever reason, and only inside of Egypt do you find papyri still intact. So that actually definitely answers my question. But I still have another question concerning Ptolemaic Egypt and Arab identity. A lot of the people who identified as Arabs in the inscriptions, they had Greek or Egyptian names. So I'm wondering, like, what did it mean to be an Arab in that period? If they had Greek and Egyptian names, they also wrote in Greek. We don't have any evidence, at least from that region, of them writing in Arabic. What did it mean to be an Arab in that period? Because as you mentioned, they had different occupations. You can't just say that they were pastoralists or they were settled people or they were a bird augurer or a barber. You know, it creates, in my mind, I cannot pin down what it is that makes someone an Arab in that period.
I think it's very difficult to tell because we don't have enough evidence. I mean, it would be lovely if in all these papyri are administrative papyri, unfortunately, but if we had a poem or a book written by an Arab, then you might find some Arabic loanwords in the Greek. You know, that would be wonderful, but we're not likely to find that, I suspect. But so I have suggested, and it's purely an hypothesis, a suggestion, that what identified Arabs to themselves and to each other over this huge area, the whole of the Levant and Mesopotamia and Egypt and so on, was a mixture of the language they spoke and the, albeit lots of different dialects, and some common cultural phenomena. So very much as today, somebody from Morocco and somebody from Lebanon and somebody from Iraq or Saudi Arabia, they all recognize each other as Arabs, even though they have very different cultures, but they can't understand each other's dialects often, but they recognize each other as Arabs. And I think something like that would explain how you get all these different groups of people who must have called themselves Arabs, because we have it in Greek and Latin. They're all called Arabs, not something else. And that suggests that they were, that's what they called themselves. But it can only be an hypothesis, unfortunately, because we can't ask them.
No. And hopefully maybe later on we discover something from something personal from one of them talking about how they're an Arab and give us more information about the subject. But I would like to discuss the kingdom of Nabatea, or the Nabateans. I remember reading something from you that the Arabic language played a major cultural role in Nabatean society. I think also where you might have didn't think that at one point, but with more evidence that came along, you lean more towards that Arabic did play a major role in their society. I was wondering, did the Nabateans identify as Arab? Do we have anything from the Nabateans in Aramaic saying I am an Arab or anything of that sort?
Unfortunately not, but they're consistently called Arabs by their neighbors, by the Jews, and also by some Greek writers. So what seems to be is that they, if I'm right in thinking that to be an Arab means that you speak Arabic and you have some forms of Arab culture you share with other Arabs, then that's what would have distinguished them as Arabs. But they tend to call themselves Nabateans, but we have only, I think, 3 or 4 instances of somebody saying, I'm a Nabatean.
And that was outside of Nabatea.
Outside of Nabatea.
And I believe it might have been Ahmed Al-Jalad who had mentioned inside of somewhere, you don't need to necessarily, like when I'm in California, I don't need to identify as a Californian. Only since being in England, do people ask me where I'm from, and I have to assert that identity. So that definitely made sense to me when he had mentioned that.
I think I said that actually when I was.
Okay, you know, I've watched so many of both these guys' videos.
He makes it too.
I mean, I watch so many of you guys' videos. I probably get some of the words you guys say mixed
Don't worry, it's all right.
And now, when the kingdom of Nabatea was annexed and it became the Provincia of the Roman Provincia of Arabia, or do you even say that right, Provincia, or is it
Provincia normally?
Okay, yeah, because that's what Peter Webb, how he pronounced it, and I was just wondering, okay, he knows more than I do, so maybe I'm saying it incorrectly.
So you can either say the province of Arabia, or you can use the Latin Provincia Arabia.
I think the Latin sounds more cool. Yeah, Arabia. But since that transition from the kingdom of Nabatea to Provincia Arabia, you also see it add another layer to Arab identity. To now, people who are living within the province are considered Arabs, regardless of their background or the language that they speak. And then the people who were normally considered Arabs became Saracens.
Yes.
And it almost seems like that gives a little bit of credence to Peter Webb's theory that Arab started out as I'm not saying that's what I believe, but I can almost see a connection, or someone making the argument that the term Arab in Provincia Arabia went back to an administrative term, like Peter Webb theorized it was, starting with the Assyrians. But let's see, how did I want to, and I kind of want to include the Anfadat inscription into this, but I'm not sure if it was constructed during Provincia Arabia or it was before, because I have a couple dates for the Anfadat, AD 88 and possibly AD 125, or it couldn't have been no later than 150. And in that inscription, it contains 6 lines, 4 of which are in Aramaic and 2 are in Arabic. I know I said a lot. So my question is this: it seems like with the annexation of the kingdom of Nabatea and the coming, the creation of Provincia Arabia, that Arabic starts to become more pronounced, that you start seeing it more in writing and starting to reach an elevated status. Like I mentioned in the Anfadat, the last 2 lines are in Arabic, and I believe that's one of the only inscriptions from that period of time where we have anything in Arabic. I believe 1 of 3. You clean up anything that I said. I know it was a bunch of jumbled up, but this part is not as clear to me as maybe the other parts.
Okay, well, when the Romans took over Nabatea, of course, they took over the government and they made Greek the language of administration, and Latin was the language of the army. This was the same in the whole of the Eastern Empire. In the West, Latin was everything. But of course, people went on speaking as they'd spoken before, presumably Arabic, we don't know, and the Nabatean society and culture went on as before. And so what for the Anfadat inscription, I find no evidence for the various dates which have been given to it.
Okay.
I think it's very very difficult to date it, and things like using paleography to date it, the shape of the letters and so on. When you're dealing with a single graffito, which is basically what it is, it's carved on a rock out in the desert. You can't say, well, this letter looks like this, and so it must be 25 AD or whatever. You know, it doesn't work like that. So what I have suggested is that this graffito, which is fairly close to the city of Aboda, in the Negev desert in southern Israel. And Aboda was set up by the Nabateans as a city in memory of the first king Obodas of Nabatea, who they elevated to a deity. He became a god. So there were obviously services going on in Aboda, Abodat. It depends how you like to pronounce it. It's very confusing because you have the Aramaic pronunciation, you have the Hebrew pronunciation, A Macdonald, and you have an Arabic pronunciation, Ein Abdat. So anyway, I have suggested that the two lines of Arabic are actually a quotation from the liturgy in praise of the divine Abodas, that this, the writer of the Graffito, who is asking for protection from the deity, has quoted this line in praise, these two lines in praise of the deity from this, this liturgy. Now, if the Nabateans believed that you couldn't write down Arabic, which is what seems to have been the very general, apart from the nomads, this seems to have been the general idea, you couldn't write down Arabic, the liturgy would be spoken in Arabic, but not written down. So it would be passed from one priest to the next as a verbal liturgy. And this was an attempt just to write these two lines because he was recording a prayer to look after him. We also have much later, in the 3rd century AD, Epiphanius, a Greek scholar, says that in Petra, and Elusa, another city in the Negev, they prayed in Arabic, which is also very interesting. So what I'm suggesting is that in religion, they retained the religious liturgies and rites from their nomadic times before they settled. They kept them in Arabic, and so passed them on verbally from generation to generation. You get a similar thing in the law courts when you have the Nachal Heder papyri, which were found in a cave on the west side of the Red Sea, of the Dead Sea, and they were the documents, the legal documents of a Jewish woman called Babatha, who escaped at the time of in the 1830s, the 130s AD. There was the Bar Kokhba revolt among the Jews in what was in the province of Judea, and the army, the Roman army from the province of Arabia, which was old Nabatea, came in and joined. And so this woman's village was right on the border of the province of Arabia and the province of Judea. And so she escaped and hid in this cave and unfortunately died there. And her papers were only discovered in 1971, I think. But in these legal papers, she had documents in Greek, Hebrew, Jewish Aramaic, and Nabatean Aramaic. And very interestingly, in the Nabatean Aramaic, the Aramaic legal terms are followed by the same term in Arabic, written in the Aramaic script, and so on. And that shows that there was a legal vocabulary in Arabic. It wasn't just, for casual conversation. And so I've suggested, and again, it's purely a suggestion, that in the law courts, the proceedings were conducted in Arabic, but they were recorded in Aramaic. And we have exactly the same situation in medieval England, where the proceedings happened in English or sometimes Norman French, but they were recorded in Latin.
Oh, wow.
And so from that, and these are two, very small things, but I've suggested that actually the cultural and religious and legal life was conducted in Arabic, spoken, but had to be, when it had to be written down, it had to be written down in Aramaic, because Arabic was considered an unwritten language.
I do want to ask you about the Ruwafa inscription. There's no Arabic in that inscription. It's written in Greek and Aramaic. But the interesting part about that is that it does, from what I understand, have an Arabic word with the name of Thamud from the famed Quranic stories. I'm not sure if they're from the famed Quranic stories, but hearing the name, I'm kind of making a connection. I could be wrong. But that is actually what I found to be very interesting, is that they are mentioned in this inscription which I'm not sure if they're a nation, a confederation, but the word used to describe what they were, I thought was very interesting. And how they were kind of brought into the Roman Empire, or made to be a part of the Roman Empire, if I understood correctly. If you could just explain that for me.
Yes, absolutely. So Ruwafa is an isolated spot to the west of Alula, but absolutely with nothing visible around it. And as far as we can see, even in ancient times, we haven't got any ruins around it. There is water in a cave not too far away. And there seems to have been there was a temple, a small temple was built there by the Romans, and on the lintel of the main entrance was an inscription in Greek for the Roman side and Nabatean for the local side. In this inscription, it says that this temple was built for the glory of the emperors. There was Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, who were twin emperors at the time. And they were, not literally twins, but they were emperors at the same time.
So Marcus Aurelius and I can't remember the other guy's name.
Lucius Verus.
So they were separate people.
Yes. Absolutely.
But see, what does it mean when Lucius became or took the name Marcus Aurelius, if I understood that correctly? Okay, maybe I didn't understand what I was reading. Because
two different people, they decided to rule together.
Okay.
So this is about between 166 and 169 AD. And it clearly, probably almost certainly wasn't built by the tribe of Thamud. It was built by Roman builders, because they mention also thanks to the governor of Arabia Provincia for help with the building, so to speak. But anyway, in this, there is a single Arabic word in the Nabatean part, which is sharaka, or sharakat, in fact. And nowadays, this word means a company, like an industrial company or a commercial company. But originally, it means a group to which you join voluntarily, as opposed to a tribe or a confederation which you were born into. And that's a very important distinction in a tribal society. And what in the Greek translation, the Greek version, it's ethnos, which can mean can also be used to mean a company, but it's generally literally means a nation, a people. Now, what is very interesting here is that almost exactly at the same time, there is a Roman historian who's writing about the Roman army, describing the Roman army, and he describes groups of native peoples from the different provinces of the empire being enlisted in the Roman army in groups which he calls nationes, natio, from which we get nation, of course. And so ethnos is the exact Greek translation of natio, and sharika would be a very good explanation of natio in Arabic. And so what I have suggested is that that it's not the tribe or confederation of Thamud, it's this new military group, the natio of the Thamud, and you have British nationes, you have different tribes in different peoples, from the Huns and Germans, well, probably not the Huns, but Germans and Belgians and so on. So we know about these all over the empire. And so this seems to have been their way of celebrating their joining the Roman army and giving their allegiance to the two emperors. And so it is written in the most beautiful calligraphic Nabatean. And it's just a pity that probably very few people in Thamud could have read it. But,
probably nice to look at.
Lovely to look at, absolutely, yes. And we have similar temples in other parts of the empire, written by local, erected by nationes, which is the plural of natio, from different parts of the empire. And the local god, who is actually mentioned not in this big inscription, but in other inscriptions at Ruafa, by a priest of this god, was called Allah. Now, not the Allah of Islam, but it could be Ilah. It could be, just somebody called God, sort of, not with a small g, not a big g.
Yeah, and I think even in the Bible they have that where people are called gods, and it's not the the God in heaven above, but I wonder in what context calling someone God meant in that language.
Yes, it's very difficult to know. But,
and just a couple more questions. I'm not going to hold you for too much longer. I would love to talk about the Namara inscription. That's one of my favorite inscriptions, and it's from the historical content, the mystery, the language that it was written in is just such a phenomenal inscription. From in the Namara inscription, it's the funerary inscription of Mara al-Qais. And even his name is a bit of a debate. How you say it? I've seen it spelled Emerald Qais, like the 6th century Arab poet, and some people have even made the mistake of believing they are one and the same, even though they're not totally far apart, away from each other. But in your book, or actually in the book edited by Greg Fisher, Arabs and Empires Before Islam, in the first chapter, Arabs and Empire Before the 6th Century, you mentioned that his name is more correctly pronounced Maro Qais. And also, we're not sure if he is the second Lukamid king, or are there any other theories on who Mara al-Qais could be?
So it's they think he was second Lahmid king. So
did I say?
You said Lukamid, but I mean it's actually Lahmid.
Okay, all right. You know, Americans, we love to butcher the pronunciation of things, so please excuse me.
No, that's fine. Just so that it's to your listeners and viewers and so on. Yes, the evidence for it is not very strong, but it's a possibility. What he was doing at Namara, of course, is a big problem, because the inscription doesn't say that. But I have I've worked quite a lot at Namara, the site of Namara, in the days before the wars in Syria, and it has the remains of a Roman fort. So Namara is a mountain, a small mountain, an island in the middle of a wadi, a great valley that goes through. So it's got water on either side of it when you get the rains, but it's dry for most of the year. And on top of it, there is the remains of a small Roman fort, most of the stones of which were plundered to make a mausoleum in the Middle Ages. So what people often think of as the Roman fort is actually this mausoleum, but you can still see the outline of the Roman fort. But what is also interesting is that on the areas of desert around this, there are quite large areas of single stones being set up sort of at regular intervals, and great sort of lines of them like this, which look like tombstones, very much like as if they're there. And so they need, of course, to be excavated, but unfortunately the Civil War came before we could do that. But if it is there are hundreds and hundreds of them. I mean, so if it is a graveyard, it looks as if the people were all killed at the same time, all died at the same time. So that would explain if there was a battle there and he was killed and Imrul Qais was, or I've done it now, Imrul Qais was killed in the battle. That would explain why his mausoleum is there a kilometer away from Namara itself.
And from what I understand, the Lakhmids were a vassalage of the Persian Empire, and the Al-Namara is on the Roman side.
Yeah.
But then again, in the inscription, it says that he basically seems like he was working for both.
Yeah.
Maybe I think in your book you mentioned or in your article you mentioned that maybe at the end of his life he veered more towards the Roman side, but early on it was a possibility that he was more of a vassalage with Persia.
It's certainly possible. We don't know with the very early Lakhmids how much they were vassals of the Persians, because we have that they're only mentioned as the ancestors of people later on, of kings who later on. We don't actually have information about them themselves. Okay. So it's possible, and he does say in the inscriptions that he made his sons proxies for the Romans and the Persians, and this was a new reading, I think, of the inscription there, which you find in the Greg Fisher book. So he was clearly a very important man who, and it is infuriating that none of the classical sources mention him, but he either that or he had somebody with a great imagination writing his epitaph. But it looks as if he was able to dominate nomadic tribes as well as the settled people, the Sha'ab, and as I say, get his sons at least to work for both the Persians and the Romans. But apart from that, it's very difficult to actually put him into our knowledge of history of that area. There's one very nice, very small detail in the inscription, that the only word that isn't Arabic in the inscription is the word for son of, which is bar, which is Aramaic rather than bin. And this went on right into the early Islamic period as being, it was just one of these fossils from the Aramaic type that went on being used. Rather as we use a lot of Latin fossils in English, like etc. and so on. But that's just a curiosity. I mean,
and in the Namara inscription, I guess it is one of 3 inscriptions in Arabic with someone identifying as an Arab, king of the Arabs. What did that, or king of all the Arabs? One thing that I found interesting about that term, king of all the Arabs, is that following it, it only mentions 3 tribes: Nizar, Madhij, if I pronounce that correctly, and Ma'ad.
Yes.
In Peter Webb's book, he translate, okay, yeah, king of all the Arabs, just as it is, but instead of, and he dominated Ma'ad or ruled Ma'ad, he translates it as king of Ma'ad. And from that, he believes Ma'ad was a separate entity from king of the Arabs. And following in that direction, he believes that Ma'ad weren't Arabs at all, that it was another tribal, super tribal identity that wasn't the possession of any single tribe, but how a collection of tribes understood each other. And he also wrote a paper about it that is in, he also wrote an article that is in Umayyad World, the rise of Ma'ad in the Umayyad period. And he has other things from literature talking about them. How do you feel about Ma'ad being a separate entity away from the Arabs? Or were they considered Arabs like Nizar, Mahij, or were these Central Arabian tribes not completely Arab? It's a bit confusing for me when I think about it, mainly because, you know, we imagine, well, no, I'm not gonna put my foot in my mouth.
No, it is extremely confusing and very difficult. Because we get the name mentioned quite a lot, both in South Arabian inscriptions and in the North, but we don't get any detail about who they were. So it's purely a question of speculating and trying to fit. I mean, it's a jigsaw with most of the pieces missing, and I don't know. I mean, I just don't have enough evidence to come to any sort of conclusion, I'm afraid, about Ma'ad, except that they do seem to have been something rather different from other tribes. I mean, all tribes. But what that difference was is another matter. And Michael Svetla wrote a very long article on Ma'ad. But in the end, it is just, speculation, I'm afraid. It's very, very difficult. Maybe I'm being too depressing, but it's...
No, I actually like that there's a bit of mystery when looking into pre-Islamic Arabia and the early history of Islam. For me, it's not off-putting at all. I know for some people, they want to know exactly what happened and everything clearly defined for them. But I like the little bit of speculation and theorizing that comes with not knowing exactly all the details. And this right here will be my last set of questions, and it's on the Arabic language before the advent of Islam. And you mentioned something that I found to be very interesting. The Arabic language was not written down in its early stages. It was more of a spoken language. And when it became or started to become written down, it was not in a script identifiable as Arabic today. Can you please explain that for me? Where was Arabic hidden before it became what we understand to be Arabic today?
Well, Arabic seems to have been, well, if we accept that one way of identifying an Arab in antiquity was that he or she spoke Arabic, and that is, is just a hypothesis, then Arabic was spoken over a very wide area of Egypt, Levant, parts of what's now Iraq, and the northern part of Arabia, and possibly more. But because it was spoken, people didn't write it down. And as I say, it's only by accident that these nomads in southern Syria and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, who wrote the Safavidic inscriptions, wrote as they spoke. And it's very interesting that we can catch dialectal differences of dialect in the graffiti that they write. Some will spell a word in one way as being pronounced in one way, and others will do the same word but spelt in another way. So we know that they spoke it, but otherwise nobody else seems to have written it down until quite late, like presumably the C.A Macdonald inscription and then the Namara inscription and so on. But these are very exceptional things. Generally, it seems to have been thought of as an unwritten language, rather as, for instance, the modern South Arabian languages in parts of Yemen and Dhofar in southern Oman and so on, until very recently were unwritten. And so if you wanted somebody to write, if you wanted to write something, a letter to somebody, you got somebody to write it in Arabic. And they then had to get somebody to translate it back into your language. But it clearly was behind the Aramaic, which the Nabateans were writing. So the Nabateans, instead of, unlike the nomads, they decided to use a language which was the lingua franca, was this sort of common language throughout the Middle East, which everybody spoke and had a certain prestige to it. So the very first time we hear about the Nabateans was when they were still nomads, and they were around Petra, and they were attacked by the Seleucid king, by the king, and they wrote a letter to him to complain, and they wrote it in Aramaic letters. It says in the history of so they were clearly using Aramaic as a written language. So that went on until about the 3rd century AD. So the Romans had conquered, had finished off the Nabatean kingdom and made it into the province of Arabia in 106 AD. And they were actually generally much more interested in the Jordanian and Syrian parts of the Nabatean Empire rather than the Northwest Arabian, mainly because they had diverted the south to north trade in frankincense and spices to the sea. It was much easier. They worked out the problem with the Red Sea is that the prevailing wind is from the north. So if you're trying to go from south to north in a sailing ship, it's actually very difficult if you don't know how to tack, which is how you go around. And the Romans knew how to do that, learned how to do that. And so most of the produce was put on ships down in Yemen and just brought up to Suez and so on. So they Northwest Arabia became less and less interesting to the Romans. They were there for a bit, but one of the effects was that whereas Greek became the official language in Jordan and Syria, in Northwest Arabia, Nabatean Aramaic went on being the general written language. But gradually, sort of over the centuries, fewer and fewer people bothered to learn the Aramaic language. And they had a few of these what we call them fossils, Aramaic fossils, like etc. in English, from a Latin fossil. And so, but anything they wanted to say that wasn't standard with these fossils, they would write in Arabic, but in the Arabic language, but written in this Nabatean Aramaic script. Now, the problem was, of course, that the Nabatean script only had 22 letters, and several of these letters had come together to be the same shape for 2 or more different letters. And so it was very ambiguous when you were trying to write Arabic, which has 28 consonants in this. But anyway, they went on, and eventually, we know this from the graffiti that they left. Gradually, they were writing only Arabic, except for bar, the word for son of, which stuck. And so gradually we got this, and then we don't know when, but at some stage they started distinguishing the letters which looked alike by dots, and they seem to have a very universally accepted form of which dots for which letters. Not completely universally accepted, but fairly widely accepted, because we have, for instance, the earliest Islamic papyrus from 22 of the Hijra from Egypt. It has the dots already in, not all the dots, but some of them. And the earliest Arabic inscription, which is 23 or 24 after the Hijra, also has dots. Interestingly, they put dots where you and I would think they didn't need them, where it was actually fairly obvious what the thing was. But
I guess it was trial and error at that point.
Yes, yes. But for this to work, there had to be a generally accepted interpretation of where the dots went. I don't know, I did do a lecture for the Coast University in Saudi Arabia, which is on the YouTube video is on, called the Curious History of Writing Arabic.
I watched it. I think I might have uploaded it to my channel.
Oh, right. Okay.
I'll probably have all your videos uploaded to my channel.
Okay, but that I go into it in more detail than that. That's all.
And my last question, and it's probably a huge one: the Arabization of the peninsula. I mean, hopefully people have followed the journey of Arabic from Arabs in the north, unwritten language, just spoken amongst a collection of people. How did it end up becoming the lingua franca of the Islamic Empire? How did it spread throughout the peninsula? I just find that to be so fascinating. I know Robert Hoyland's last chapter in his book, Arabs in Arabia, even though it came out 21 years ago, I felt like how he tried to describe Arabization in the last chapter was a little bit lacking. I understand it was 21 years ago, and we probably know a lot more today, but I still cannot wrap my head around how people, they had their culture, seems like their culture was tied to their language. All of a sudden, the rise of Islam comes, or the advent of Islam comes along, and people kind of ditch their language as well as adopt a different identity. And now the whole Middle East is Arabic speaking. I don't think it probably didn't happen that fast. I watched a lecture by, I believe her first name is Petra, cannot say her last name.
Petra Saperstein, yes.
Yes, and where she talked about I think she talked about the Arabization after the conquest in the Umayyad period with Abdul Malik making the administration all right in Arabic. But I'm curious, how did it happen in the early years of Islam? It's just, sorry if I'm babbling on. I just cannot wrap my mind around how I cannot see myself speaking English today, and then within a couple of generations, I'm speaking a totally different language, and then my descendants thereafter are as well. And I'm pretty sure it happened in other places in history, but because we're talking about the Arabian Peninsula, I just cannot wrap my mind around it.
No, well, it is very difficult, and we don't know really how it spread within the peninsula Arabic, whether it was there all the time. We just don't know whether what the population of Arabia before Islam spoke. Probably more and more tribes did speak Arabic, but we don't know. I mean, it's just pure speculation. But it would seem that they must have done, because by the time of the Prophet, he was sending out missionaries within the peninsula, and they were speaking Arabic, so that presumably their hearers were also Arabic speakers. When that first happened, goodness knows whether they were always there. I mean, so when I say, you know, we don't know the Arabian Peninsula, whether it was actually full of Arabs or not, it's just we shouldn't assume that it was, because all the Arabias that are mentioned in ancient sources are up in the north. It may have been. So that's one thing. Then with the conquests, when you're conquered, and it clearly becomes permanent, then if you want to get on in the world, you learn the conqueror's language.
Beat them, join them.
And yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, I mean, one of the extraordinary things is that most of the Arab grammarians, famous Arab grammarians and Arab scholars, were Persian. And we're actually, you know, writing about the Arabic language and so on, but they were actually all Persian because they had a long tradition of scholarship, of course, so I don't think it's really surprising, especially when the language is associated so closely with the religion as it is with, you know, with Christianity. The Christians translated their holy books into the languages of the place they came from. But the Muslims, you had to learn Arabic to read the holy book. And so it was just a different way around. But it did mean that the Arabic language spread much more. And I think it's the same with all empires, you know, when the Europeans, the British or the French or the Dutch.
Yeah, of course. I mean, look at Latin America, you know, how did they end up speaking Spanish? It's, you know, just one of those things. But, and maybe it didn't happen as fast as I think it happened, but just to see such cultural change within amount of several decades, I just find that to be fascinating. I'm pretty sure it happened to other places in the world, but still interesting to see.
Yes, I mean, it was an extraordinary event, and I don't think I can't think of a parallel really, a sort of exact parallel like that. It was amazing, and you know, compared to other conquerors in that area, when you think of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane and so on, the amount of destruction that they did, the Muslims actually did relatively little destruction. They came in and conquered, and I think that was also probably helped people to accept more, because they'd had so much, particularly in the Levant, there'd been the battles between the Byzantines and the Persians had been such going on for years and years and years, and if you've got one power that came in and kept order, that's really what people wanted, I think.
Definitely, and you kind of see that in the tradition when Muhammad went to Medina, and one of the reasons why they wanted him there was to act as a mediator. So that definitely makes sense. And do you have any closing remarks, Michael, before we part ways, unfortunately, because I really enjoyed this conversation and hearing about pre-Islamic Arabia, is, you know, I can sit here all day and listen about it. And probably when I get off, I'll be reading about it anyway. So, but yeah, if there's anything you'd like to share, anything that you're working on, where we can find anything you have coming up next, I will plug your Academia EDU page so people can read all of your phenomenal works. And, you know,
don't want to put them off too much. No, well, I just thank you very much indeed. It's been extremely interesting talking to you. You ask very interesting questions, and I hope that I've managed to answer them, you know, more or less.
Oh no, I mean, you did more than answer them. I mean, I really like the way that you go off, and I don't want to say a tangent because tangent can kind of seem, but I really do like how I can ask you a question and you just take off with it. And I was hoping my questions weren't too like basic. You know, you're an academic, you study this in detail. I hope I'm not asking like preschool questions or anything like that.
Certainly not. No. It's but you can see that my enthusiasm for the subject anyway. And I find it's a great passion, and I hope other people will enjoy it too.
Oh yes, and I really actually hope other people take on the profession as an epigraphist. I mean, it seems like revolutionary steps are being made in the field of epigraphy, as well as more and more people becoming interested. So I hope with all of that going on, we will continue seeing more developments in this field.
I hope so. Absolutely. Inshallah.
All right. God willing. All right. Thank you, Michael. It was a total pleasure speaking with you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And, you know, I hope to speak to you again if I have any questions concerning your work.
Absolutely do. Thank you very much. Ahlan wa sahlan. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.